any time myself, so I'm going to pass directly over to Loretta Hieber Girardet, who I introduced earlier. Loretta is the chair of the Interagency Standing Committee Task Force on Needs Assessment, and she's the chief of the Assessment and Classification of Emergencies project within OCHA. The NATF is responsible for developing guidance and tools that support a coordinated and common approach to assessments in humanitarian emergencies. Loretta is a senior humanitarian advisor at OCHA, and she's previously worked for other UN organizations, in particular the World Health Organization, as part of the post-9/11 emergency response team in Afghanistan and Pakistan. She has an NGO background with extensive field experience in various crisis situations in a wide range of countries and Asian and African settings. So without further ado, let me pass over to you. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure which microphone is supposed to be working.
Yes, I think.
Thank you, and thank you, Richard, for your presentation, but also for all of the work that you've been doing in this area. It's an area of work which we in the humanitarian community and we in OCHA take very seriously and know that it's extremely difficult to get traction in the field. And I'll be talking about some of the reasons why it's so difficult and the work that we're trying to undertake in Geneva and in New York and in the field to improve the evidence base for humanitarian action. So as Wendy said, I chair the Interagency Needs Assessment Task Force. This is a grouping of UN agencies and NGOs that have come together to look at how to harmonize cross-sector or multi-sectoral needs assessments and to try to really tackle the very difficult challenge of getting reliable and timely data to decision makers in an emergency situation so that we have a much better evidence base in which to develop humanitarian programming. It's been, according to the head of the IASC, one of the more difficult task forces. And it's not surprising. Assessments form very much the basis of agencies' programming. Their funding is very much dependent on the types of assessments that are carried out and the needs that are identified. So it's an area of work that the humanitarian community holds very close to themselves, and to try to come in and to coordinate that and come up with a joint approach has been a real challenge over the years. Nevertheless, we've been tackling some of the political issues that Richard mentioned. For example, how do we coordinate ourselves in an emergency so that we can do a rapid assessment? And we've developed guidance this year called Operational Guidance on Coordinated Assessments and some tools that I'll also be talking about. And we've also developed, with the collaboration of ACAP's consortium, a roster and pool of experts who can be deployed to the field to support humanitarian agencies, and of course training, which Richard just alluded to as well. What are some of the questions that we're trying to grapple with? Well, as I've mentioned before, how do we get accurate information to decision makers in the aftermath of a disaster? Who are the decision makers? Well, it's not just the humanitarian actors who have to develop programming, but the donors as well. In fact, OCHA itself is a donor. And how do we allocate money through the SURF? How do we know which are the priority needs? Those are all issues we've been really grappling with. And how do we engage the relevant actors and represent their information needs without extending the scope or the size of an assessment so that the information that's gathered comes far too late to be of use? It's a problem we've had recurrently in emergencies. And finally, how do we avoid duplication of resources and assessment fatigue with all agencies going to the field at the same time to carry out assessments and then giving conflicting information to the decision makers over who are the affected population, what are the numbers? These are some of the issues that we've been grappling with. Two of the more recent emergencies, Manuel Bessler, who was the head of the OCHA office there, talked about the proliferation of assessments that was going on in Pakistan. So, of course, there was the large-scale MIRA assessment, but at the same time, there were up to 80 other assessments that took place in Pakistan. How do we bring those actors together and have them work jointly so that we do not have this proliferation of assessments, which, after all, is not very fair to the population that's being assessed? And, of course, in Haiti, it was a remarkable circumstances on the ground, but again, the lateness of the assessment there had an impact on the overall quality of the response. And so we're trying to learn lessons from the field and apply them. Why do we talk about coordinated assessments rather than common assessments? In typical IASC fashion, this was the subject of much discussion and debate. We refer to coordinated assessments because we recognize that at different stages of an emergency, there will be assessments carried out by single agencies or by clusters, and the challenge is not necessarily to do every assessment together, but to bring assessment data together in a coordinated fashion so that the data can be used for the benefit of the entire humanitarian community. And when we talk about coordinated assessments, we're talking about harmonized assessments. So this is where the data collection, processing, and analysis may be carried out separately, but it's brought into a shared analysis for the benefit of the humanitarian community. And we also talk about joint assessments, which is basically what Richard was referring to as common assessments. So what have been some of the key challenges of the interagency process? The first one has been, how do we organize ourselves? How do we define a coordination structure that would allow us to come together very quickly, knowing what the roles and responsibilities are, and being prepared so that we can carry out a joint assessment as soon as an emergency strikes? We don't want long timelines. We want to be able to deliver an assessment within a few weeks, but in order for this to happen, we have to have agreed roles and responsibilities, and agencies with those roles and responsibilities have to know in advance what they're expected to do. And then once we've reached agreement on this, and we did reach agreement this year, our next challenge has been to develop a technically sound and agreed common assessment methodology. When I started this work about 14 months ago, there wasn't agreement in the interagency environment of the need for a common assessment methodology. There was resistance to it, as a matter of fact. But through the process of defining the coordination structure, the various agencies and clusters came to the understanding that having an agreed assessment tool would greatly facilitate our capacity to carry out a joint assessment in the early stages of an emergency. And so we're now working on this, and it's the tool that Richard referred to as the MIRA, which I'll talk about. And finally, we're really struggling with the issue of capacity. Most humanitarian actors are not assessment experts. OCHA is a group of people who are humanitarian actors, but we're not statisticians. We don't have those assessment skills. Some of the agencies do, WFP, for example, WHO. And so the challenge is, how do we build the capacity at the field level amongst actors so that we are able to produce a statistically reliable document that can be used in all confidence to build or to develop a programming in the field. We have a vision of how we see assessments supporting what we call the program cycle. And sort of fuzzy there, but what we would like to see is a very systematic approach to an evidence base. We talk about an initial assessment. Richard referred to it in his slide. This very first scenario that would be used to inform the initial flash appeal. And this would be followed by the second phase, or a rapid assessment to the field, which will be used to inform the revision of the appeal. So it's a two-step process to give us increasingly more information on which to base our appeals. And then an ongoing coordination of assessments and collection of information throughout the course of the program cycle, with, of course, evaluations along the way. Of course, we're not here yet, but there's certainly a lot more traction than there was even 2 years ago in understanding that assessments need to precede appeals and that there needs to be ongoing assessments. It's not a one-off assessment. It's ongoing assessments throughout the course of the program cycle. I'm going to have to move a bit quickly because I put way too many slides in. But essentially, what we're talking about is a phased approach with coordination taking place at the different phases and tools that have been developed or are being developed to support each phase of an emergency, and defined roles and responsibilities. We see leadership as extremely important in ensuring that a joint assessment is carried out early in an emergency, and hence we go straight to the top and say the humanitarian coordinator is responsible for ensuring that a joint assessment is carried out. In fact, in UN Resolution 46-182, it's the role of the ERC, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, to guarantee joint assessments, and the role of the clusters and cluster members, and so forth. This is the guidance that we've developed. This is your role, this is your responsibility, and this is how you're meant to implement it in the field. Specifically on a common assessment approach, we've developed the MIRA, or we're developing the MIRA, I should say, because it still has some real conceptual issues. And it was interesting in Chiang Mai to see the reaction of a couple of different people who said, well, we want numbers. In the first 2 weeks of an emergency, we need the numbers. And of course, the methodology that's being developed is not necessarily going to give you numbers in the first 2 weeks. It's more qualitative. But we have to deal with those expectations, and that's what we're in the process of doing. We have a small group of technical agencies working on the MIRA, WHO, HNTS, UNHCR, OCHA, ACAPS Consortium, pulling together experiences from the past and trying to come up with a tool that we all collectively agree is good enough on which to base a humanitarian operation. And this is a little bit, just to give you some of the details of how it's supposed to work, is that we develop in the first 72 hours a preliminary scenario definition. Much of it's based on secondary information, and increasingly we add primary data collection. And it starts with key questions, 23 key questions that we continue to ask ourselves throughout the course of the first several weeks of an emergency. And increasingly, the information becomes more defined, deeper, and hopefully more accurate. These are just to give you a picture of what the key questions look like, the phase 1 and the phase 2 methodology, and the limitations. I think one of the real understandings that we've had is that we have tremendous limitations in the beginning of an emergency. I'm going to talk in a minute about Libya. We're just now, this week, getting access to Libya to do an assessment. And yet the flash appeal was issued several weeks ago, and the revision of the appeal was issued I think, just 3 or 4 days ago. So many different limitations in what we can do, and also the real limitations in terms of the quantity and quality. So we're trying to re-examine our expectations a little bit and figure out what is it that we can do systematically and what is it that we simply aren't able to do. Essentially, this is just a slide that shows the difference between the importance of secondary data, which we haven't necessarily spent enough time on in the past. It's understanding that we need to use baseline information more rigorously and secondary data and not focus only on primary data collection. That comes, it's an important part, but it's not the only part of an assessment. Oops, well anyhow, I'll just talk to you a minute about Libya. We've just, today or tomorrow, I'm not sure, depends on what security access is, are carrying out a joint assessment in eastern Libya. It's facilitated by OCHA, and it involves, I think, around 12 agencies representing different sectors, moving in 4 vehicles, and using the MIRA methodology as a basis. It's been adapted, obviously, to the Libyan context, but already we've learned some lessons to say, for example, that the initial analysis plan that we've developed wasn't suitable in this context. I mean, this is how we're going to have to proceed. We'll just have to try out these tools in different contexts and settings, and at the end of this year, we will adapt it and present it back to the IASC as draft guidance and draft tools. And so we'll wait for this assessment report to come forward, and we'll see, was the methodology accurate, did it work, or do we have to look at it again? Is it not suitable to conflict situations, for example? And finally, let me just end a bit. We've talked a lot about common assessments in the beginning of an emergency, and certainly within the IASC, there is a policy decision that there will be a joint assessment in the early stages. However, emergencies go on for months and months, and what we're also grappling very much with is how do we coordinate information after the common assessment or the joint assessment. And therefore, our guidance looks also at further phases, the phase 3, phase 4, when you have PDNAs, post-disaster needs assessments starting. How do we ensure, for example, that there's not a duplication of assessments at the same time? So to that end, we've developed key humanitarian indicators. And this is a set of indicators that the clusters have identified as being overarching and should be collected throughout the duration of an emergency. And we're developing also a tool called the Humanitarian Dashboard, which serves as a platform, a way of tracking information and tracking the trends throughout also the duration of an emergency. And we've recently carried out quite an extensive exercise in Pakistan using the dashboard. Very challenging, because what we found out was that the clusters are not systematically gathering information, consolidating it, and analyzing it. It's a bit of a wild west out there when it comes to information. And the dashboard's an attempt to pull it together so that we can use it in a common platform for analysis. How long will it take for the IASC to achieve its vision? I mean, we compare it a bit to the CAP, the Consolidated Appeals Process. And we think at a minimum 3 to 5 years before we would expect to see systematically the program cycle informed by assessments, consolidation of information. And a lot of this will depend very much on how fast we can build capacity in the field and how willing, I would say, the humanitarian community is to continue to engage in what is really a rather difficult process. So far, we've been quite lucky in the last year. We've had very good engagement, but with agencies cutting back on staff and we're all under time constraints. We'll have to see how it goes. But in general, I think we're pretty happy with having achieved the policy level decisions that needed to be made this year. The real challenge will be turning it into practice and making it part of every systematic response to an emergency. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Loretta.